I keep a single birthday card in my safe. It is not sentimental. It is my 40% share of a $900,000 senior care franchise, notarized on the back in my late husband's immaculate handwriting, every clause and signature block laid out with the precision of a blueprint. That little card would eventually force my brother-in-law to change bedpans in a scrub shirt that reads Dependable Liar, while every single welcome kit I send out prints his federal fraud docket number for all to see. But to understand how we got there, I have to take you back to the day after my husband's funeral, when the vultures started circling. My name is Carolyn. I am 52 years old, a retired ICU nurse who spent 28 years reading cardiac monitor strips and catching the subtle shift from normal sinus rhythm to ventricular tachycardia before the alarms even triggered. That ability to see what others missed would matter later. My late husband David was an architect, a quiet man who drafted buildings with the same precision he used to organize our legal documents into color-coded binders, every tab aligned, every page hole-punched. When pancreatic cancer took him, it hollowed me out in a way no patient loss ever had. The funeral was a blur of navy suits and lilies, and at the graveside, I hyperventilated so badly the funeral director had to bring me a paper bag and a Valium from his emergency kit. 6 months before David died, I used my entire $125,000 to launch an in-home senior care franchise with my brother-in-law Greg. I had the clinical expertise. He had the business degree and a handshake that always felt just a second too long. We signed a formal partnership agreement on June 12, 2019, notarized by a mobile notary named Patricia Doran, who came to our kitchen table and watched us sign in triplicate. David had insisted on the mobile notary, saying a third original couldn't hurt, and Patricia had a solid brass embosser that left a deep, crisp impression. The agreement gave me a 40% ownership stake and a paid position as Director of Care Coordination. The franchise, Comfort Keepers of Medford, grew fast because I trained every caregiver myself on how to document cognitive changes using a structured observation log I designed, and because I insisted on quarterly competency checks that Greg complained were too expensive. By the end of year 2, we were profitable enough that Greg bought a Lexus. I used my salary to pay off David's medical bills, one explanation of benefits at a time. David died on a Tuesday in March, and by Thursday night, Greg and his wife Tanya were standing in my living room with a binder and a box of trash bags. I was still foggy from the sedative, wrapped in an afghan my mother had crocheted, and when they walked in, Tanya immediately started opening windows as if grief were a smell that needed airing out. The discovery happened later that same evening, but first I need to tell you how they arrived. Tanya wore a black dress that looked brand new and smelled like department store perfume, not like someone who had been crying. She kept touching my shoulder and saying, "You poor thing," while her eyes scanned my bookshelves and the original oil painting David had bought me in Santa Fe, the one of a roadside chili stand at sunset that we'd always joked was our retirement plan. Greg spoke in the careful, measured tone of a man who had already rehearsed the conversation. "We just want to take care of everything, Carolyn. You shouldn't have to handle all this paper clutter." He pointed at the small secretary desk where David kept our personal files, the one with the little brass key that he'd never locked because he believed locks only kept out honest people. I stood there, still foggy, and nodded because I couldn't find the energy to argue. He and Tanya began pulling open drawers, sorting documents into a keep pile and a large black trash bag. I watched through a haze as Greg lifted a shoebox from the bottom drawer, the one where David had stored every card I ever gave him and a few he'd bought for me but never mailed. The box was a sturdy old Florsheim, the kind with a separate lid, and the corners were soft from years of being moved. He opened the lid, glanced at the top card, and said, "Just old birthday junk," and tossed the whole box into the bag. Something in me twitched. That box held cardstock that David's fingers had touched, that his fountain pen had marked. I said nothing, but I fixed the location of that bag in my mind. When they left around 9, telling me to rest and that they would come back tomorrow to discuss some business logistics, the moment their taillights disappeared, I pulled the trash bag onto the living room floor and upended it. The shoebox tumbled out, dented but intact, and I could smell the faint ghost of David's cologne still clinging to the cardboard. I sat cross-legged on the rug, slowly lifting out each card. Valentine's Day 2014, where David had drawn a tiny blueprint of our dream house, complete with a porch swing and a room labeled Carolyn's studio. A get-well card from when I had pneumonia, with a stick-figure nurse on the front who had an Roman IV pole and a determined expression. A 5th anniversary card, where he'd written a long note about the exact moment he knew he wanted to marry me, which was when I had repaired a broken chair at a dinner party using a woodworking clamp I'd pulled from my purse. And then a thick card with a watercolor iris on the cover, my favorite flower, the petals painted in that deep purple blue that always reminded me of the Colorado sky just before a thunderstorm. I opened it. David's handwriting in the dark blue ink he always used read, "Happy 50th birthday, Carolyn. You are the heart of everything. I'll always have your back. Love, David." Below that, in smaller letters that trembled just slightly, as if he'd hesitated before writing them, he added, "If things ever go wrong with Greg, look at the back. Do not trust him. Keep this safe." My hands shook as I turned the card over. The entire back surface had been covered in perfectly aligned text, typed and then signed in blue ink. It was the full partnership agreement between Gregory M. Talbot and Carolyn S. Reeves, dated June 12, 2019. Every clause was there. The detailing of my $125,000 capital contribution, the 40% ownership interest in Talbot Reeves Senior Care, LLC, the guaranteed position as Director of Care Coordination at an annual salary of $48,000, a provision that any sale of the company required my notarized signature. And at the bottom, signatures from both Greg and myself, along with the seal and signature of a licensed mobile notary named Patricia Doran, her commission number ink-stamped and legible, the embossed crimp of her brass seal raising the paper fibers, dated that same day. I ran my thumb over the notary embossment and felt the tiny ridges, the unmistakable texture of a genuine die stamp. David had notarized a duplicate original of our partnership agreement on the back of a birthday card and hidden it in a shoebox of personal keepsakes. He had written a warning inside 2 years before he even got sick. I realized then that David had seen something in Greg that I had ignored for the sake of family harmony, some predatory tilt of the chin, some too quick smile when money was mentioned. He had built me a legal life raft out of cardstock and notary ink, and he had done it without ever telling me, because he knew I would have dismissed his concerns as paranoia. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the people you trust should be held accountable for every signature they forge. I did not confront Greg immediately. Instead, I placed the birthday card inside a Ziploc bag and hid it behind the loose baseboard in the linen closet, a spot David and I had used to store emergency cash and the deed to the house. The baseboard had a hidden pressure latch he designed himself, and you had to push on the exact spot where a knot in the wood grain lined up with a tiny notch. I took 2 of my anti-anxiety pills and went to bed. The next morning, Greg and Tanya returned with a document they wanted me to sign right away. Greg sat at my kitchen table and slid a 5-page paper across the wood. A mutual release and settlement agreement. He explained, in that oily, soft voice, that the business had been struggling. Insurance reimbursements had dropped, 2 major clients had canceled, and he had been draining his personal savings to keep the payroll afloat. This agreement would relieve me of any liability and buy out my interest for a clean $5,000. He even said, "This is more than it's worth, honestly, but I want to do right by you." I could see the minute pulse in his left temple, a fluttering beat that I'd learned to associate with tachycardia caused by sympathetic nervous system arousal, the same spike I used to see on a monitor when a patient was about to code or lie. 28 years of reading vital signs had taught me that a resting heart rate above 95 often accompanied a lie. I dropped my head forward, let my shoulders slump, and let my voice go soft and slow. "I'm so tired, Greg. I can't think about numbers right now. I haven't slept more than 3 hours a night. Can we talk about this next week?" He and Tanya exchanged a look. Tanya put her hand over mine and said, "Of course, sweetie. Actually, why don't you come stay with us for a little while? Our guest suite has its own bathroom, and you won't have to be alone in this empty house." I saw the maneuver clearly by then. They wanted me in their territory, away from my own documents, dependent on their hospitality, where they could monitor my grief and accelerate the narrative that I was incapable of managing my own affairs. I said yes, because I needed to see what else they were hiding. I packed a small bag, making sure to bring my toiletry kit with my father's old lockpick set still tucked inside a rolled pair of socks, and let them drive me to their McMansion in the Ridgeview development. The guest suite was over the garage, a converted attic space with sloped ceilings and one window that looked out onto their pool. It was isolated enough that I could hear nothing from the main house unless they were shouting. It was also equipped with its own landline phone, but when I lifted the receiver to check for a dial tone, I realized it was an internal house line only, programmed to reach the kitchen and Greg's office extension, not an outside number. They had helpfully labeled it with a post-it note listing those internal numbers, plus Greg's cell, as if that were a kindness. I was effectively cut off from making unsupervised calls, and I knew then that this was not hospitality, it was containment. I settled in and began my undercover investigation the very next morning. The first thing I noticed was the sheer volume of new spending that did not match a supposedly struggling household. Tanya's kitchen had a built-in espresso machine that retailed for nearly $4,000, a gleaming meal with chrome piping, and a milk frother that hummed like a luxury car. Greg drove a Lexus that still had the temporary registration sticker on the windshield. The date punch showing it was acquired less than 2 weeks after David's terminal diagnosis. During my first afternoon there, I offered to help Tanya organize the pantry, and I spotted a receipt from a custom closet company for $18,000, dated 3 weeks after David's diagnosis, along with a brochure for a bronze sculpture of a leaping dolphin that had been commissioned for the foyer, the artist's fee penciled in at $7,000. I filed that away. Then, on my second day, the kitchen sink backed up because Tanya had poured a pan of bacon grease straight down the drain until the trap was solid with congealed fat. Greg stood over the sink, jabbing a wooden spoon into the disposal, while Tanya hovered with her phone, ready to call a plumber who charged $180 just for the service call, plus $90 per quarter hour after that. I told them I could handle it. My father, before he became a locksmith, worked as a maintenance man for a retirement community, and he taught me how to clear a P-trap by the time I was 12, using nothing but a bucket, a pipe wrench, and a wire coat hanger straightened and bent into a hook. I retrieved those items from their garage, placed the bucket under the sink, loosened the slip nuts on the P-trap with the wrench, and disconnected it. A plug of pale, hardened grease the consistency of cold candle wax slid out, and I used the coat hanger to break it into chunks. It smelled faintly of rancid bacon. Within 15 minutes, I had reassembled the fittings, tightened everything, and run the water until it flowed clean. I ignored the grease on my knuckles and the way Tanya looked at my hands like they were a different species, simultaneously grateful and repulsed. That moment planted a seed in my mind about just how helpless these people were without paid help, and how much I could do that they could not even imagine. The first concrete red flag came the following Tuesday. I was coming down the back staircase to the kitchen, the one that led from the guest suite, when I heard Greg in his home office, a converted den with French doors that he failed to close completely. He was on a speakerphone call, talking in the clipped, transactional tone he used with attorneys. "The release is absolutely airtight," he said. "She's in no condition to challenge it. I'm telling you, she can barely remember what day it is. We need to finalize the assignment by next Friday or the offer expires." I pressed myself against the wall and held my breath. I carefully slipped my small notebook from my pocket, a spiral pad I had started keeping hidden in the lining of my suitcase, and wrote the date, time, and key phrases. Later, I heard the name Sunset Senior Holdings, a national chain that had been acquiring regional home care companies at aggressive multiples. I knew from my own industry research, the kind I used to do on quiet Saturday mornings with David while we drank coffee, that Sunset typically paid between $800,000 and $1.2 million for a franchise of our size. I also knew that the offer expiration implied a ticking clock, which gave me a timeline. The second red flag came days later. Tanya returned from an afternoon shopping trip with 6 glossy bags from Nordstrom and handed Greg a receipt without any apparent concern. I glanced at the bottom line as she passed, roughly $3,700. This was not the spending pattern of a household supposedly draining its savings to keep a business afloat. A few evenings later, Greg and Tanya hosted a dinner party with 2 other couples, and from the balcony of my guest suite, I cracked the window open and listened. I heard Greg bragging about a new investment property in a lakeside development, something about a boat slip and a 2-story deck, and one of the guests asked how the senior care market was treating him. Greg laughed and said, "We're about to get a very generous buyout from a national player, so the lake house is just a little reward for all the stress." I made a mental note of the development's name, later confirming through a quick internet search on my phone that the lot alone had sold for $220,000, and that building permits had been pulled under Talbot Properties, LLC, an entity I had never heard mentioned in any partnership meeting. The third red flag came from their trash. They kept their garbage bins in a locked enclosure on the side of the house, a wooden slatted box with a padlock, supposedly to keep raccoons out. I noticed that the padlock was a cheap master lock, 3 with a standard 4-pin core, the kind I could shim in seconds with a thin piece of metal cut from a soda can. One morning, while they were at what they called a financial planning meeting, I slipped outside with a section of aluminum I had snipped from a ginger ale can in the kitchen, using a pair of kitchen shears that I cleaned and replaced. I bent it into a slight curve and slid it between the shackle and the lock body, pushing the retaining pin until the shackle popped open with a click. I retrieved a clear plastic bag from the top of the bin, one that looked newer and less soiled than the kitchen scraps. It was full of shredded documents. I replaced the bag with an empty one I had brought from the guest bathroom so the absence wouldn't be noticed, relocked the bin, and carried the evidence back to my suite. I locked my door and spread the contents across the bed. For the next 3 hours, I reconstructed strips by matching edges, working like I used to piece together torn EKG strips to confirm arrhythmias. I sorted shreds by paper color first, then by the direction of the printed lines, laying them out on the glass top of a small patio table I had dragged beside the bed, with a desk lamp underneath to backlight the edges. I taped each match with tiny pieces of invisible tape, building a jigsaw puzzle of betrayal. What emerged was a draft of the buyout letter from Sunset Senior Holdings, offering $900,000 for the franchise assets, contingent on clear title and verification of ownership. There was also a memo from Greg's attorney outlining the steps to remove Carolyn's interest and referencing a release document to be executed via a notary named Sharon R. Keller, a name I had never seen before. The memo specified that the release should be prepared and notarized without my presence or knowledge, relying on a previously obtained signature sample. I photographed every reconstructed page with my phone, then burned the strips in the guest suite's small fireplace, piece by piece, until nothing remained but ash. I also used my phone to access the state's notary public database and searched for Sharon R. Keller. No record found. The commission number format mentioned in the memo was 8 digits, but every active notary I knew used a 6-digit commission number. That alone was a smoking gun. Now I knew Greg was preparing to sell the company. I needed to find the forged release itself. The door to his home office was locked with a standard interior privacy knob, a quick-set wafer lock that I recognized immediately. My father had been a locksmith for 40 years, and when I was a teenager, he taught me how to pick wafer locks using a tension wrench and a half-diamond rake, because he said it was a skill that built patience and precise fingertip sensitivity, the ability to feel the faint resistance of each wafer as it lifts. I had kept a small leather pick set in my toiletry bag ever since college, a habit that David always found amusing and occasionally useful when we locked ourselves out. I waited until the next time Greg and Tanya left for a long appointment, a couples therapy session that Tanya had complained about because Greg always dominated the conversation. The moment their SUV cleared the driveway, I retrieved my pick set and returned to the office door. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway and applied gentle clockwise pressure. Then I slid the half-diamond rake in and worked it back and forth across the wafer pins, feeling the subtle click as each wafer set into the shear line. Within 45 seconds, the plug rotated and the lock opened with a soft clunk. Inside, I found a steel filing cabinet with a key lock in the top drawer, not a combination. I used the same pick technique to open it. Inside, a hanging folder labeled Release of Ownership. Sunset Acquisition contained the document I had been dreading. Assignment and Release of Ownership Interest. It purported to transfer my entire 40% stake to Greg for a consideration of $5,000, signed by me and notarized by a person whose stamp reads Sharon R. Keller. Notary Public. Below my signature was a date, March 28, just 2 weeks after David's funeral, a date on which I had been heavily sedated and at no point had signed anything in front of any notary. I pulled a jeweler's loupe from my pocket, the small 10-power magnifier I had carried since my nursing days, to read the fine print on medication vials and infusion pump labels. Under magnification, I could see that my signature had been traced. The pen pressure was uniform, machine-like, lacking the slight tremor of a living hand, and the ink color had the too perfect consistency of a high-end archival printer pigment, not the slight density variation of a ballpoint pen. There were tiny hesitation points where the pen had lifted and lowered without overlapping strokes, a classic sign of an auto-tracing tool. The notary seal was slightly blurred at the edges, a telltale sign of a scanned and reprinted stamp rather than an embossed metal crimp. I compared it to the crisp, dimensional seal on David's card, where the paper fibers were permanently deformed by the dye. I also found a second document in the same folder, wire transfer instructions directing the proceeds of the sunset sale into a personal account in Greg's name only, at a bank in Nevada, not the business operating account. That was an additional layer of embezzlement. I photographed every page with my phone, carefully replaced everything exactly as I had found it, relocked the cabinet, and retreated to the guest suite. That night I made a call to Patricia Doran from my cell phone, risking the short window while Greg and Tanya were asleep. I found her number in an old email. When she answered, I asked her to verify her commission and the details of the June 12, 2019 notarization. She remembered us vividly, she said, because David had been so particular about having her stamp a third duplicate copy on the back of a birthday card, something she had never done before or since. He had asked her to use her most durable archival ink and to make the embossment extra deep, and he had paid her an extra $50 to keep a scanned copy on file, which she confirmed she still had. She verified that her seal and signature on that card were authentic and that her commission remained active. That gave me absolute confidence. The card was the real instrument, and Greg's document was a fraudulent imitation. The next day I called Michael Henley, a corporate attorney who had been David's best friend since architecture school. I described the birthday card, the forged release, the buyout offer, the wire transfer instructions, and the reconstructed trash documents. Michael was silent for 10 full seconds. Then he said, "Carolyn, the notarized card is a fully valid legal instrument. Under the Uniform Partnership Act and the specific governing law clause in your agreement, a sale of 40% or more of the company's assets requires the notarized consent of all partners. If Greg tries to close this deal with a forged release, he is committing wire fraud, identity theft, and forgery, all federal felonies. And because the buyout documents will cross state lines, the FBI will have jurisdiction. The card is your dead man's switch." Michael reached out to a contact he had at the FBI's white-collar crime division, a special agent named Rebecca Costello, who had recently given a presentation on notary fraud at his firm. Within 2 days, I was sitting in an unmarked sedan in a grocery store parking lot, handing Agent Costello the flash drive with photographs of the forged release, the reconstructed buyout letter, and the wire instructions. She explained that the Bureau was already investigating a string of fraudulent notary stamps linked to an identity theft ring operating out of Nevada, and the name Sharon R. Keller was known to them as a fictitious identity used to produce counterfeit seals. She showed me a printed roster page with other fake names, all with the same 8-digit commission number format. By forging that release, Greg had inadvertently tied himself to an active federal investigation. Agent Costello asked me to continue playing confused and compliant, and to allow Greg to walk me into the closing meeting at the title company. She needed him to present the forged document in a commercial transaction to establish intent to defraud. The moment he did, she and her team would arrest him. She also asked me not to leave the house or change my routine in any detectable way. She took a handwriting sample from me on the spot, using a standard FBI exemplar form, and told me the forensic document examiner would have a preliminary match within hours to confirm the forgery. Over the next 10 days, I deepened my compliance act. I let Greg bring me more settlement papers, which I took and said I would read later. I allowed Tanya to take me to her hairdresser, where I sat passively while she told the stylist, "She's been so fragile since David passed." I nodded along like a woman too stunned to object. I even helped with more household tasks, unclogging the guest bathroom toilet after someone flushed a wipe, fixing a jammed garbage disposal, all without complaint, all while watching them fumble the simplest repairs. Their helplessness reinforced how little they actually managed in their own lives. They depended on contractors, accountants, and eventually on my silence. The maximum cruelty beat came 2 days before the closing, and it is the moment that extinguished any remaining shred of familial loyalty I still felt for my brother-in-law. I had told Agent Costello that I wanted to test them one final time, to see if there was any humanity left under Greg's ambition. She approved a controlled scenario after confirming it would not compromise the operation. I would stage a medical emergency in their hallway, using my clinical knowledge to simulate a collapse with symptoms consistent with a hypoglycemic syncope. I spent hours researching the exact presentation: sudden pallor, clammy skin, rapid but shallow cuss-mall breathing, and a vacant stare. I practiced the fall on a gym mat in my guest suite until the muscle memory was automatic, timing the respirations to 3 per second. I also palmed a small capsule of glucose gel from my nursing kit and smeared a trace on my lips to make them look clammy and pale. I set up my phone camera on a shelf to record the entire sequence with Agent Costello's approval so that I would have an objective record of their behavior. At 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening, as Greg and Tanya were watching television in the living room, I walked down the staircase clutching a manila envelope I had purposefully left in plain view on my desk. The envelope contained nothing but printer paper, but I had written release agreement in block letters on the outside, large enough to read from across the foyer. Halfway across the tile floor, I let my knees buckle. I gasped, pressed a hand to my chest, and went down hard, the envelope skittering across the grout and landing near Greg's slippered feet. I lay motionless, eyes half closed, breathing in those rapid, shallow gasps. Through my lashes, I watched Greg stand up. He did not kneel. He did not check my pulse or call for Tanya to dial 911. He stepped right over my hips, his slippers nearly brushing my arm, and bent to retrieve the envelope. He ripped it open, scanned the blank pages inside, and muttered this was the one I needed. Then he turned and walked back toward his office without a backward glance. Tanya stayed on the couch. She looked at me and said, "Are you okay?" But she did not get up, did not offer a hand, did not even pause the television. She said it in a flat, distracted tone, like she was asking about the weather. I waited a full 45 seconds until Greg was out of earshot, and then I opened my eyes, pushed myself to a sitting position, and said, "I'm fine. I just got lightheaded." Tanya replied, "Maybe you should eat something," and then she muted the TV just long enough to call toward the office, "Greg, she's up," before unmuting it again. Neither of them offered me water or a chair. I walked back to the guest suite, retrieved my phone from the shelf, and watched the recording. Seeing it from the outside, the way his foot passed 6 inches from my face, the way her gaze barely flickered from the screen, there was nothing left inside them worth saving. The confrontation happened on the morning of June 17, a title company office on the 4th floor of a glass and steel building in downtown Medford. Greg and Tanya dressed me in a gray cardigan that Tanya had picked out, and Greg told me that we were going to a meeting to finalize the settlement. In the car, he handed me a pen and a single-page document he said was a receipt for my severance. I took it, folded it without looking, and tucked it into my purse, which made him smile that too-quick smile again. Inside, the conference room had a long walnut table surrounded by 10 leather chairs. On one side sat 2 representatives from Sunset Senior Holdings, a senior vice president of acquisitions with a briefcase full of binders, and the company's general counsel, a woman in a navy suit who kept her hands folded like someone accustomed to spotting trouble. On the other side sat Greg, Tanya, and a man introduced as their business attorney, a thin man whose tie knot was too loose. I was seated at the far end, slightly apart, like an afterthought. The title officer, a silver-haired woman named Mrs. Ellerby, opened the meeting by stating the purpose and asking for verification that all ownership interests had been cleared for transfer. Greg's attorney placed the forged assignment and release of ownership interest on the table and said, "MS. Reeves has voluntarily relinquished all claims to a 40% stake. The document is properly notarized and witnessed. Mrs." Ellerby examined the page with the careful eye of someone who had seen title fraud before. She pulled out a loupe of her own and angled the document under the light. She then ran the notary seal under a UV light, the kind that reveals security fibers in real notary stamps. Nothing fluoresced. The notary seal appears irregular, she announced. It has no embossed crimp, no micro-printed border, and no UV-reactive ink. The commission number is 8 digits, which does not match any active notary in this state. I am going to call the Secretary of State's office directly to confirm. She lifted the receiver on the conference room's speakerphone and dialed a number from memory. We all heard the automated menu and then the voice of a clerk. Mrs. Ellerby, read the commission number aloud. After a pause, the clerk responded, "That number does not exist in our database, and to my knowledge, all active notary commissions in the state are 6 digits. Mrs. Ellerby thanked the clerk and hung up. Then she looked up at Greg and added, "And where is MS? Reeves here, because our instructions from Sunset require a live notarized signature from any listed partner holding 5% or more." Greg's face tightened, a muscle jumping under his ear. He gestured toward me and said, "She's here. But she already signed the release, as you can see. She no longer has a stake. That was my cue." I stood up, reached into my purse, and withdrew the sealed Ziploc bag containing David's birthday card. I walked to the head of the table and placed the card, face down with the notarized agreement clearly visible, directly in front of the Sunset General Counsel. My voice was steady. "I have not signed any release. This notarized partnership agreement from June 12, 2019, shows that I hold 40% of Talbot Reeves Senior Care. The document on the table with my name on it is a forgery. I would be happy to provide a fingerprint analysis and handwriting exemplars. I have already filed a fraud complaint with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Greg lunged forward and grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He snatched at the card, but I pulled it back, and the Sunset General Counsel intercepted, holding up a hand. She lifted the card, studied the notary seal with Mrs. Ellerby's magnifying loupe, and ran her fingertip over the embossment. "This is Patricia Doran's notary commission," she said. "It's registered and active, and her seal matches the jurat. The embossment is genuine. This agreement is valid and supersedes any release." She turned to Greg. "You represented that you held 100% ownership. That representation is materially false. This acquisition is suspended pending a full investigation." At that moment, the conference room door opened and Agent Costello walked in with 2 uniformed FBI agents. She placed handcuffs on Greg, who was sputtering that the card was fake, that I was mentally unstable. Then she turned to Tanya, who had gone very pale. She placed handcuffs on Tanya as well, reading them their Miranda rights. Greg stared at me with a mixture of fury and confusion. He said, "How did you even get that?" I looked at him and said the words I had been rehearsing for weeks. "David knew exactly who you were, and he made sure his promise would outlive him." The aftermath was not quiet, but it was complete. The FBI's forensic document examiner confirmed that my signature on the forged release was a traced facsimile generated from a scanned copy of a legitimate document, probably a deposit slip Greg had lifted from my old desk. The counterfeit notary stamp was traced back through Greg's PayPal account to a document mill in Nevada that Agent Costello's team had already infiltrated. Greg was charged with wire fraud, identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud. Under the weight of irrefutable evidence, he pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 36 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. His federal docket number became 21 CR 00147. Tanya, who had marginally participated in the cover-up and benefited from the spending, received 5 years of probation and was ordered to pay restitution for the fraudulent use of business funds. The Lexus was repossessed, the lake house lot was seized and sold at auction, and the bronze dolphin sculpture was liquidated along with most of their furniture to satisfy the restitution order. Tanya's Nordstrom credit card was cut up in front of the probation officer. The franchise, Talbot Reeves Senior Care, was returned to me as the sole remaining principal. I negotiated directly with Sunset Senior Holdings and ultimately declined their buyout offer because I realized the franchise was not just a business. It was a platform. I renamed it Careless Betrayal Senior Services, registered the LLC, and hired a new operations manager, a woman named Sandra Okonkwo who had spent 15 years running compliance for a Medicaid managed care plan and could sniff out billing irregularities like a bloodhound. We expanded to 4 counties and opened a training center called the David Reeves Center for Caregiver Integrity, where every new caregiver spends 16 hours learning how to spot financial exploitation of the elderly, because I will never again let a predator operate in the shadows. Sandra and I designed a curriculum that includes case studies on notary fraud, forged documents, and the warning signs of undue influence. And every trainee leaves with a laminated quick reference card that I personally wrote. Greg's supervised release included a requirement that he maintain gainful employment approved by his probation officer. At his sentencing, I proposed to the court that he could work off his restitution debt by serving as a certified nurse assistant at my company, at a reduced wage, with all earnings garnished directly to the court. The judge, visibly unimpressed by Greg's lack of remorse, agreed. Greg, who once wore bespoke suits to franchisee conferences, now reports to my facility manager every morning in navy blue scrubs. The scrub shirt has our logo on the front, an iris intertwined with a heartbeat line, and on the back, in embroidered block letters the color of a hazard sign, it reads Dependable Liar. He changes bedpans, turns immobile clients, and empties catheter bags under the supervision of senior CNAs. I personally train to ensure that no one is ever demeaned, only that Greg does the work he once thought was beneath him. His probation officer makes unannounced visits, and Greg is required to wear the scrub shirt at all times while on duty. No jacket, no layers. The first time I saw him in it, he avoided eye contact and stared at a spot on the floor, and I felt not anger, but a quiet, steady hum of something that felt very close to peace. And every welcome kit we send to new client families, the folder with the care plan and the emergency contacts and the HIPAA authorization, includes a single printed card. It reads, Careless Betrayal Senior Services believes in radical transparency. Our company was almost stolen by a family member who forged a signature and defrauded the federal government. His case number is 221CR000147. We believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Some families have flinched at first, but more have told us that the card was the reason they chose us. Because if we are that honest about our own scars, we will be honest about their loved ones. David used to say that the truest measure of an architect is not what you build, but what remains standing after the storm. I keep his birthday card in a fireproof safe now, right beside the deed to the house he designed and the marriage certificate we signed together. Every time I look at that little watercolor iris, I remind myself that trust is not a gift you give by default. It is a contract you notarize, and when someone breaks it, you enforce every clause, no matter how long it takes. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let us know in the comments. If you believe that integrity should always leave a paper trail, hit like and subscribe, because around here we believe that the best revenge is a notarized document and the patience to let it speak. I'll see you in the next story.